It was a busy morning at the airport, a sea of faces rushing past each other as the young man walked slowly through the terminal, his steps deliberate, as though he was searching for something or maybe someone. But to the casual observer, he was just another lone traveler, his dark sunglasses hiding any emotion that might give him away. He didn't make eye contact with anyone around him. But somehow there was an air of quiet intensity about him that made the flight attendant notice she had seen many passengers before. But this one felt different. She couldn't quite place it. But there was something about his posture, his way of walking, as if he had a purpose, a destination, that was beyond the simple act of boarding a flight. She watched him move towards gate 24, his eyes scanning the crowd just enough to suggest he was waiting for someone. But no one was with him, no luggage aside from a small carry-on bag. He didn't look like he was going on a vacation, and he certainly didn't look like a business traveler. He looked more like someone who was looking for something specific. She felt a small sense of curiosity. She had seen many people travel alone. But this man was different. There was an energy about him that didn't quite fit the usual profile of a solo traveler. Was he running away from something? Was he running towards something? Or maybe he just needed to escape for a little while. The plane was ready for boarding, and the flight attendant made her way down the aisle preparing to greet passengers. As they boarded, when she passed the man, she caught his gaze. For a moment, his eyes hiding behind the dark sunglasses. Yet there was something in the way he looked at her that made her pause. He didn't speak, just nodded as he made his way to his seat on the plane. It was a small gesture, but it made her feel uneasy, as if she had just glimpsed a hidden story she wasn't supposed to see. As she continued with her tasks, she couldn't stop thinking about him, the way he sat in his seat, so still, so focused, his eyes never leaving the window. Not once did he glance at the other passengers, as if he didn't belong with them. Or maybe it was because he was waiting for someone to sit beside him, someone who wasn't there. She had seen this kind of nervous energy before. It was the kind of energy that suggested a reunion was about to happen, or a long-awaited meeting that was just out of reach. But no one came to sit beside him, no one approached him. He sat alone. It was then that the flight attendant decided to approach him with a polite smile. She asked him the simple question that most solo travelers get asked. "Are you traveling alone?" She didn't expect much of a response, maybe just a casual nod. But his answer was different. The way he said yes, it was almost too quiet, almost too certain. She wasn't sure if he was just tired, or if there was something more going on beneath the surface. It didn't matter to him, though it was as if he had already closed off to the world around him, his focus entirely elsewhere. As she walked away, she found herself wondering who he was waiting for. Why did he look so tense? Why was he acting like he was on the verge of something important? It didn't add up. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary passenger, and that perhaps she had just met a man with a story far more complex than she could ever imagine. The plane began to climb into the sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the young man remained eerily quiet, his gaze fixed on the window, as if there was something out there only he could see. The flight attendant continued with her duties, but every time she passed his seat, she couldn't help but glance at him. There was something unsettling about the way he held himself, so still, so distant from the rest of the passengers, his eyes never leaving the window, as if he was lost in thought, or perhaps waiting for some sign, something to tell him that what he was doing was right. But there was no sign, nothing to suggest he wasn't just like everyone else. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This man wasn't like the others she had served today. She had seen her fair share of solo travelers over the years, but none had made her feel the way he did. None had made her wonder so much about what lay behind their calm exterior. She noticed his hands were clenched tightly around the armrests, his knuckles white with tension every now and then he would shift in his seat and look down at his watch almost nervously, as if counting down the minutes to something important. But what was he waiting for? Who was he waiting for? Her curiosity began to grow as she made her rounds, checking on passengers. She noticed that the man's seat remained empty beside him. The space that should have been filled with a companion was left untouched, and he seemed even more tense, now his leg bouncing up and down nervously. The flight attendant couldn't help but wonder if he was expecting someone to board the plane at the last minute. Was someone supposed to sit next to him? Was there a secret waiting to be revealed, something that would explain the strange energy surrounding him? She leaned against the cart as she waited for the seatbelt sign to turn off, trying to steal another glance at him. He hadn't moved since the takeoff, his attention fixed firmly outside the window. But what was he looking at? Was he looking for a familiar face? Was he thinking about the place he was headed to? Or was he dreading it? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't figure it out. And the longer she watched him, the more unsettled she became. He wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't just another lonely traveler on a business trip or a vacation. There was something deeper, something that set him apart from everyone else on the plane. As the flight progressed, she noticed that his breathing had become a little more rapid, his chest rising and falling a little faster than before, his eyes still glued to the window. He seemed to be watching the changing clouds below them, his body tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. But what could be so important, what could be so urgent, that it would leave him in such a state of constant tension? She couldn't help herself. She had to know. She couldn't just let it go. The man wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was different. He had a story, and she was going to find out what it was. As the hours passed, and the plane drew closer to its destination, she found herself checking on him more frequently, her curiosity getting the better of her each time. He was still there, still waiting for something. But what was it? And why did it feel like everything about this flight was leading to something that would change everything? As the flight carried on, the young man's behavior became even more noticeable. His every move seemed calculated, like a man who was waiting for something. But what was it? What was so important that it had him so wound up she couldn't stop herself from looking over at him? Every few minutes she had tried to keep herself busy with her duties, but her eyes always seemed to find their way back to him there. He was sitting so still, staring out of the window, like he was waiting for the world to change, or waiting for something to appear in the sky that would tell him everything was okay. But nothing changed. The sky was endless and empty, yet he remained there just staring into it, his jaw clenched tight. The flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something right in front of her. But what could it be? What could make this man so obsessed with that empty space outside the window? She had served hundreds of passengers before, but none had felt this way. None had made her so anxious. There was an invisible pull in the air. Whenever she got near him, a tension that was almost suffocating. Every time she glanced at him, she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She felt like she was on the edge of a discovery, something that would change everything. But she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The man's hands had stopped fidgeting. They were now resting on his lap. But his fingers were twitching, like he couldn't hold still any longer. The muscles in his face were tense, his eyes moving rapidly from side to side, as though he was searching for something or someone. But there was no one beside him, no one waiting to greet him, no one getting on the plane. He was alone, she thought. At least that's what she thought. The hours seemed to stretch on, and the plane started to approach its destination. The young man's gaze never left the window, as if he was watching for a sign from the sky, like the world outside held the key to whatever it was that had him so deeply locked in his own thoughts. But nothing changed. The clouds were now tinged with the orange glow of sunset, but still he waited, his posture becoming even more rigid, as if the very act of waiting had consumed him entirely. He seemed lost in a world of his own, completely unaware of the bustle of the rest of the passengers around him. It was as if time itself had slowed for him. The flight attendant continued to watch him, her mind racing with possibilities. What could he be waiting for? And why did it feel like this flight had more significance than it appeared? She couldn't understand it. The man wasn't acting like someone on vacation or someone heading to a business meeting. He wasn't reading a book or working on his laptop. He wasn't checking his phone every few minutes like the others. He was consumed with something else, something she couldn't quite grasp. But whatever it was pulling him toward the end of this flight with a sense of urgency that she could feel for across the aisle. The plane began its final descent, the seatbelt sign blinking on. She watched the young man stand up a little too early, his body tense. Like a spring waiting to snap, he grabbed his bag in a swift motion, almost too quickly, and turned his eyes darting toward the window one last time. As if this was the moment, he had been waiting for the moment. Everything would make sense, she didn't know why, but she felt a sense of dread begin to creep up on her. As the plane touched down, she had a feeling that something was about to happen, something big, and she wouldn't be able to look away. The plane touched down with a soft thud, but it didn't feel like just another arrival. Something was different. The young man didn't sit back in his seat as the other passengers did. He didn't relax as the wheels met the tarmac. His eyes were wide now, his body tense like a coil about to snap. He grabbed his bag tightly, his fingers digging into the strap, as if he couldn't wait to get off the plane fast enough. His leg was shaking nervously, and she saw him glance quickly at the exit door, as if he was anticipating something. He was no longer the calm traveler she had seen at the beginning now. He was someone else completely, someone desperate almost. The flight attendant couldn't help but watch him as the seatbelt sign flickered off. He didn't wait for the usual rush of passengers to stand up. He was already on his feet before the aisles had cleared. His movements were sharp and purposeful, his eyes darting around the cabin, like he was searching for something or someone. He was no longer the quiet man staring out of the window. He had transformed into someone who seemed to be in a hurry, like time was running out for him, like every second counted. She felt the shift in the air, a shift that was hard to ignore. The tension was palpable, now thick enough to feel like it could suffocate her if she wasn't careful. She moved down the aisle, checking on the passengers as they gathered their things. But she kept an eye on him. She couldn't look away. There was something so urgent in the way he moved. His energy seemed to ripple through the air with a magnetic force. She had seen people in a rush before, but this was different. This was something more. This was a man on the verge of something, something he had been waiting for, something he had been anticipating for far too long. And the closer they got to the gate, the more his anxiety seemed to grow. When the plane finally came to a full stop, the young man didn't wait for the doors to open. He was already up and moving towards the exit, as if he couldn't wait another second. His steps were quick, his pace unwavering. He pushed past other passengers without a second glance. Not once did he acknowledge the others around him. His focus was laser sharp, and she watched him in silence, wondering what he was looking for, wondering who he was waiting for. As he reached the front of the plane, he stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the area outside the door. His hands were clenched tightly around his bag. The flight attendant could see his chest rising and falling rapidly with every breath he took, and for the first time she saw the faintest hint of fear in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there, hidden beneath the calm mask he had been wearing all flight. He was nervous, almost terrified. And that's when she realized whatever he had been waiting for wasn't just a reunion. It was something more, something that held a greater significance than she had first imagined. She couldn't stop herself as she stood in the doorway, watching him, his body stiff, as he waited for the door to open. And that's when she saw a figure standing off in the distance near the gate, a woman holding something in her arms. She was looking toward the plane, and the young man's eyes locked onto hers. Instantly his whole demeanor shifted, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, like a missing piece of a puzzle had just been placed perfectly into place. And for the first time since she had seen him, he smiled a smile so full of emotion, it was almost unrecognizable. And in that moment, the flight attendant understood that this man hadn't been waiting for just any arrival. He had been waiting for something far more precious than she could have ever imagined. The young man stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on the woman standing near the gate, his body trembling slightly as he took a step forward. And then another. He was moving now, but it wasn't a casual walk. It was a hurried step, as if his legs couldn't move fast enough. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the flight attendant watched in disbelief as the man began to push his way through the crowd. The woman was still there, just a few feet away, holding something in her arms. And that's when it hit her. She could see what he had been waiting for, what had been pulling him forward all this time. It wasn't just an ordinary reunion. It was something far more profound, something far more emotional. The woman was holding a small child wrapped in a blanket, and the young man's face softened for the first time all flight. As he saw her holding the child in her arms, he took one more step, and then another, his pace quickening with every move. He made. The air around him was heavy with anticipation, and the flight attendant felt her heart race with him. What was this moment? What had this man been waiting for all this time? Why had he been so on edge? And now she understood. The child in the woman's arms was his child, his little girl. His face now lit up with joy and relief. As he approached the woman, his eyes never leaving her, or the child she was holding. The woman's face was full of emotion too, and as their eyes met, the young man's hand reached out slowly, as though afraid to touch something so precious, something so fragile. The flight attendant could see the way his hands shook, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the child's blanket. The woman smiled gently and handed the child to him without a word. And in that moment, the young man's entire demeanor changed. It was like all the tension that had been holding him together just dissolved. His face flooded with tears. As he gently cradled the child in his arms, the world around them seemed to disappear, and it was just him, the woman, and the child, the three of them locked in a moment so intimate and powerful that the flight attendant couldn't help but feel like an intruder watching something so deeply personal and sacred. The young man whispered something to the child softly, as if speaking words only meant for her, and the woman stood beside him, watching him hold the child with such tenderness that it made the flight attendant's chest tighten. There was so much love in that moment, so much unspoken emotion, that the flight attendant felt it too, as if she had become a part of their journey, a witness to something that could never be fully understood. Without experiencing it herself, she wanted to look away, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from this beautiful reunion, this moment of pure emotion that had been waiting to unfold the entire flight. She knew now that the young man hadn't been nervous about a meeting or a reunion in the way she had thought. He wasn't simply waiting for someone to sit beside him on the plane. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment he would hold his child in his arms after what had clearly been a long separation. And in that moment, everything made sense. His anxiousness, his restlessness, his urgency, all of it had been leading to this. This was the reason he had been so tense throughout the flight, the reason he had been unable to relax or think of anything else. As the man held his child close, the woman wrapped her arms around them both, and the three of them stood together, their family now reunited, and the flight attendant felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had witnessed something truly special, something so powerful that it left her feeling speechless, and for the first time all day she understood why this story had been worth telling, this story of a father's love, a father's wait, for the one person who could heal this heart. The flight attendant stood in the doorway, still watching them, as the man gently cradled the child in his arms, the woman by his side, their faces glowing with an unspoken happiness that filled the air around them. She could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. The tension that had been building throughout the flight seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by something pure and tender, something so human it was impossible to ignore. She watched them for a few more moments as they spoke softly to each other, the woman stroking the child's hair, and the man speaking in a low voice that only they could hear. And for a brief second, she felt like she was intruding on something private. But she couldn't help herself. She was drawn into their world. Their reunion was a story far bigger than anything she had expected. It was a love story, not of romance, but of a father's love for his child, a love so deep it transcended the long wait, the anxious moments, the distance that had kept them apart for so long. The moment felt eternal, yet fleeting at the same time. The man's eyes never left the child's face, and the flight attendant felt herself growing more curious about him, more curious about what had kept them apart. How long had it been since they had seen each other? And why had this reunion been so incredibly important to him? Why had he been so desperate to hold his child? Why had it made him seem so tense and disconnected during the entire flight? There was a story there, a story she wanted to understand, but one that seemed too personal to ask about, one that could never be told through words alone. The woman leaned over and whispered something in the man's ear, and his face softened even more, his eyes filled with tears. As he nodded, he seemed to hold the child even closer, almost as if he couldn't believe she was finally in his arms. The flight attendant's heart ached as she watched the scene unfold before her. It was one of those moments that made her realize how little she truly understood about the people she served every day, how much of their lives were hidden from view, how much they carried with them behind their eyes that only a rare few could ever see. The young man stood there for a while, just holding the child with one arm, and the woman with the other, his posture relaxed now, but still filled with a quiet reverence, like he couldn't believe this moment had arrived. The flight attendant wondered how long it had been since they'd seen each other, what had kept them apart. Had he been away serving his country? Had he been working abroad? Was there some long separation she couldn't possibly imagine or understand? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they turned toward the gate, the young man holding the woman's hand, and the child in his arms, the three of them moving together as one unit, as if nothing could tear them apart again. The flight attendant watched them disappear into the crowd, her heart still heavy with emotion. She couldn't explain what it was that made her feel so connected to their story. Maybe it was the raw emotion of their reunion. Maybe it was the way their love had overcome every obstacle. Maybe it was the way they had waited so patiently for each other, despite everything that life had thrown their way. She couldn't help but think about how often we all wait for something or someone in life, how sometimes the wait feels unbearable, and how when that moment finally arrives it feels as though time itself has stopped. She wondered if the young man's story was the same as many others, a story of waiting for something precious, something worth every second of the journey. But what she knew for sure was that what she had witnessed was more than just a reunion. It was a testament to love, to resilience, and to the incredible strength of the human heart. The flight attendant stood there for a long time, even after the family had disappeared into the crowd, her mind still reeling from what she had just witnessed. The emotions, the tension, the profound connection between the man and the child were still fresh in her mind. It was as though their story had imprinted itself on her heart in a way that was impossible to forget. She had seen many reunions in her years of flying, but none quite like this one, none that had felt so raw, so real. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what she had seen, more layers hidden beneath the surface. She kept asking herself what had kept them apart for so long. Why had the man been so on edge? Why had he seemed so distant from the moment he stepped onto the plane? It didn't make sense to her. She couldn't put the pieces together. As she walked down the aisle to clean up the remaining trays and cups, she couldn't stop thinking about the young man. She had seen 1,000 faces like his, but this one stood out like no other. There was something about his eyes, something about the way he had looked at the woman and the child, like they were the entire world to him, like every minute they had been apart had been a minute too long. She had seen that look before in people who had experienced deep loss. But this wasn't a look of sorrow. It was a look of relief, of finally coming home. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened, what had separated them, what kind of life had they lived that brought them to this moment, this reunion so filled with emotion, so much more than a simple greeting between family members. She passed through the cabin again, her steps slow, as she tried to shake the feeling of being caught in the middle of something so intimate, something so personal. She glanced out the window as the plane sat on the tarmac. But her thoughts were elsewhere. Her mind wandered back to the man, his nervousness, his anticipation, his need to hold that child. She couldn't shake the image of his hands, shaking when he first took the child in his arms. It had seemed like a moment that had been waiting to happen for a lifetime, like everything in his life had been building up to this very second. But why had he needed to wait so long to hold his child? Was he a father who had been forced into some terrible separation? Had he been serving overseas? Had he been fighting for his country? Had he lost time that could never be replaced? She turned the corner of the terminal toward the gate area where the young family had disappeared into the crowd, and for just a moment she thought she saw him again. She blinked quickly and scanned the crowd, but there was no sign of him or the woman or the child. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe she was just so consumed by the encounter that her mind was playing tricks on her, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that lingered in the air, like the residue of a powerful emotion, something that had stayed with her even after they were gone. It was then that a thought crossed her mind that made her pause. Was this reunion really the end of their story? Or was it just the beginning? Had they overcome the hardest part? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? Something that neither she nor anyone else could see at first glance. She had no way of knowing, but something told her that this moment was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, a puzzle that the young man had been trying to put together for so long, and maybe, just maybe, she would never know the full truth of what had kept them apart. But she could feel it now. There was more to this story than she could ever truly understand. She knew one thing for sure, though no matter how much time passed, she would always remember this moment, the way the man had looked at the child and the woman, as if nothing else in the world mattered more than they did. She would remember how the air had shifted with their reunion, how the weight of the weight had fallen away, and left only love so pure it transcended everything else. And even though the answers to all her questions may never come, she knew that their story would stay with her forever, etched in her mind like the most powerful of memories. The days passed after the flight, and the flight attendant couldn't shake the memory of the young man and his family. No matter how hard she tried to put it out of her mind, it kept coming back, the image of him holding the child in his arms, the way his face had lit up with joy, the relief in his eyes. It stayed with her like a weight that she couldn't shake. She wondered about their past, about the moments they had lost, what had kept them apart for so long. Why had it taken so much time for them to find each other again? She tried to tell herself it was just another reunion, but it wasn't. It was different. It was something deeper, something that she couldn't fully grasp, and perhaps never would. She continued working her shifts as usual, but the memory lingered in the back of her mind. Whenever she closed her eyes, she could see the man's face, the way he had looked at the child with such intensity, as if he were seeing her for the first time after years of being apart. It made her wonder how many other families were out there living stories, just like that, ones that went unnoticed by most people, a story of separation and longing, and finally reunion. But there was something more about theirs, something that pulled at her, something that made her feel like there was more to it than a simple family coming back together. One afternoon she was working on a new flight when a familiar name flashed across the boarding pass. It was the young man. His name was listed as the lead passenger on a return flight. She had to pause for a moment as she read it again. He was flying again. She wondered where he was going, and if he was returning home, or if he was heading somewhere else. Was he coming back to the woman and the child? Or was there something more to his journey? She couldn't help herself. As she thought about it more than she should, she wondered if she would see him again, if their paths would cross once more. The flight was long, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. She found herself glancing at the passengers, more often than usual, hoping to see his face, hoping that she would get another glimpse of him. But as the hours passed, and the flight went on, there was no sign of him. She checked the passenger list again and again, but he was nowhere to be found. Maybe she had been imagining it. Maybe he wasn't even on this flight, but the name had been there, so why wasn't he on board? Had he changed his plans? Had something happened to him and his family? Or had they already left for home? Before the plane even took off, she felt a pang of disappointment wash over her, but there was nothing she could do but move on with her duties. The plane landed, and the passengers began to disembark as the flight attendant helped with the last of the bags, and said her goodbyes. She caught a glimpse of a man walking toward the gate. He was tall with dark hair and a familiar posture. He was carrying a small suitcase, and he looked hurried. His eyes scanned the crowd with purpose. She thought she recognized him, and her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the young man from the flight, the one who had been so filled with anticipation, who had waited so long to hold his child. And she couldn't believe it. She had no idea how to react. Her feet felt frozen in place as she watched him approach. But before she could move, he disappeared into the crowd, as quickly as he had come, just another fleeting moment in the chaos of the terminal. But the feeling of familiarity and curiosity stayed with her. Later that night, as she lay in bed, trying to make sense of everything, she couldn't help but wonder if their story was really finished, or if it was just beginning, if there were more chapters still left unwritten, ones that no one would ever see, ones that might never make it into the light. And even though she may never know the full truth about the man and his family, she knew one thing for certain: their story had left its mark on her heart. It had taught her that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones we never see coming, the ones that we can't predict or understand. But that still changes forever, and even if she never crossed paths with them again, she would carry their story with her, always a story that reminded her of the quiet power of love and the things that are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes.